Welcome to episode 8 of Rugged Wisdom. Today we're asking ourselves some curious questions. We're talking about 10 things that Jesus could have done, but he didn't. You know, Jesus grew up in this is my bobblehead Jesus that lives out in my shop on my workbench. Jesus grew up in a craftsman's workshop. His dad was a carpenter. We know this about him from multiple sources, and that brought up the question, like, what happened to his dad? We don't know, but it got me thinking, well, if his dad died early, could have Jesus resurrected him? Or maybe he died on a construction site in a construction accident. We literally don't know. That's just supposition. But the question is, could Jesus have done something about it? Well, that got me thinking about 10 things Jesus could have done, but for some reason he didn't. We're going to find out and talk about why today. Let's jump into this episode. Welcome to the Rugged Wisdom Podcast, hosted by myself, Scott Johnson, and my buddy, Joe Wedra. Join us each week as we discuss timeless truths, share great stories, and create momentum in our daily lives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share wherever you enjoy this podcast. We'd greatly appreciate it. And now, let's get on with the show.
Welcome back in Rugged Wisdom. I am Joe Wedra with Scott Johnson. Fun episode today. We're talking about, actually, we've talked about this for a little while that we wanted to do. I'll let you set it up. We wanted to run this episode and record it for a while.
We've been talking about this episode for a bit. We will title it Things Jesus Could Have Done, but Didn't.
Interesting, right off the bat. That we talked about this before. That title, that topic is going to grab attention just for the sheer sense of what you just said.
Right. Well, it's a bit of amusing in a way, just kind of looking at the biblical narratives. And I guess let me put some brackets around this, right? To say, when we say what Jesus could have done but didn't, I'm talking about the incarnation story, like just kind of what we understand about the Son of God coming to earth in that bracket, right? Not because God could have chosen to do some other revelation, some different incarnation, but God chose. So in that bracket, looking at the things that he chose to do, and maybe, well, what didn't he do that he could have done that could have changed the whole game?
All from our earthly perspective.
Which
is fascinating. So again, I just wanted to set the tone there because it's an interesting, when we talk about things Jesus could have done but didn't, immediately I think my mind, when we first talked about this, my first mind went to, whoa. Like, that's interesting. Like, what he could have done but he didn't do. Well, didn't Jesus do everything that he was supposed to do? Didn't he fulfill his purpose? Why are we even talking about what Jesus could have done? But so at first I had these reservations, but after we started talking about it, I'm like, it is interesting because it, to me, from our earthly point of view, it almost, when we talk about this, and hopefully it comes through in this episode, when we talk about this, it just gives you a further, I don't want to use the word appreciation, but an understanding and appreciation of what Jesus did do on the earth.
I think also, I would like for people to maybe reread the scriptures with paying attention to maybe what's not there. Or, okay, if Jesus did that, I wonder what it would look like if he would have done activity Y, if he did X, or ever how you want to say that. Like if he did choice A, but what if he did B? And so I know we got a list of these things to kind of get things going, but now you brought this up kind of at a context. You asked me a question one day. You asked me, hey, do you know Mike Todd? I think was the question. And then I said, I think I was at home.
Can you give your response?
So for those that do know the pastor, Mike Todd, you asked me that question. And the reality was, when you asked me the question, I think I was on my front porch one day, and we were talking on the phone, and my answer was, no, I don't. And then I think I had to further qualify that to say, surprisingly enough, as a guy who, I'm a pastor, for those who don't know, I've been pastoring, preaching, communicating for some years. And I don't know Mike Todd, and I don't know much about him. I did look a little bit because you asked me the question. I was like, I'll check it out.
Hit the Google.
Yeah, I hit the Googles. But interestingly enough, I don't watch a lot of preachers.
Yeah.
And I know it's probably weird.
Before we jump into our topic, it surprised me when you said that. Because I feel like, and I don't know why, but I think we have this perspective of, the preacher probably watches other preachers.
All right, so we'll get back to Mike Todd in a minute, so that question,
you said you don't watch a lot of preachers, and
Yeah.
I was like, no, I don't.
Yeah.
I have some that I watch
Sure.
and or listen to or read their books. I really don't watch a lot of like contemporary, but it's the same thing with like I would say a lot of I'm old school.
Yeah.
So I don't watch a lot of like preachers. I listen to some, but I have some guys that I go to.
Yeah.
But I'm a very boring person, to be honest with you. So I like primary text, and I like,
Sure.
and so I'm aware of some people, but I don't currently follow a lot of trends. Like I
get it.
I don't, and I'm not saying anything disparaging.
Yeah, sure.
It's probably just my bandwidth.
Mhm.
I don't really make a lot of room in my bandwidth for a lot of like contemporary preaching and things. And that's not to say anything for or against. It's just, you ask me a question, do I watch a lot of common, or I would say modern preachers who are on the internet a lot? And I don't.
Well, the reason we bring it up is because I did bring up this clip because I knew we were going to have a conversation surrounding this topic. And just coincidentally, whether you want to call it coincidental or not, that this clip came into my algorithm, that's a whole nother topic for another day. But a clip from Mike Todd. He's a pastor at Transformation Church, I believe, in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
So Tulsa?
I believe.
Full disclosure, I don't even know where Transformation Church, and some people probably watching this like, Scott, you don't know. Like, there's just a lot of things admittedly I don't know.
I think it's an Oklahoma-based church. But anyway, this clip, it's from about a year ago, but it started, you know how things make their rounds again. Sure. Something from years ago makes the rounds. This made its rounds, and I just thought it kind of was interesting to set up this conversation. I'm not saying we'll just play the clip.
So you're going to get my reaction.
Yeah,
to this clip,
I'm
right?
curious.
So this will be my reaction. I'm aware of the clip. I haven't watched it in the full context. So you're going to grab it on the YouTubes?
Yep, I'm going to grab it, and then you'll be able to watch, and then we'll check it out.
And just let me react to it.
Scott's reaction.
And this is one of the thoughts I want to end with, if it's okay. Jesus never reached his potential. Now, I know this has messed with a lot of people's theology. Because since I've been young, everybody's like, Mike, you need to reach your potential. Everything that God said and put inside of you, it needs to happen. But when I studied the scriptures, he never reached his potential. When he died up on the cross, he said 3 words. He said, it is finished. What was finished? Not his potential, because he had the potential to overthrow Caesar. He had the potential to be a Roman guard. He had the potential to do all kinds of stuff. The thing that was finished was his purpose. And if you don't follow the pace of God, if you don't have perseverance in hard times, if you don't get patient, you spend your life trying to fulfill your potential, and you'll die never reaching your purpose.
Okay, so watch the video, and hopefully it makes a little more sense to why, when we talked about 10 things Jesus could have done but didn't, which we're going to get into, why I thought that clip, because it is culturally relevant, I thought it was a good introduction.
And I'm probably the least culture relevant person that you're going to watch or listen to. So I like that I'm glad you brought that video to my attention. I wasn't aware of it because, like I said, I'm not really familiar with this pastor. Don't know a lot about him. Mm-hmm. And but I would say the first thing I noticed about it was like, I love the hype men. You can pull that back up for me there. He had some hype men around him.
He did.
But I say that in jest because we do this too. When I'm finishing up a sermon, we've got people coming up and the band's coming up and all that. So I get it. But I like he's got Bieber beside him. There's that. If it's not Bieber, it's his brother.
That's his clothing line.
It probably. Yeah. See, that's what you would know that, and I would not. I have no idea.
It is. That's the Bieber.
Oh, that's the Biebs clothing line.
Yeah. You don't have any of that in your closet?
I don't. I wear either Corbin Collective shirts or C3 shirt or something that I would wear on the farm. So that's my first reaction. Stickler point. Jesus didn't say 3 words on the cross. That was 1 word, but whatever. Tetelestai is 1 word. It is finished.
That's what jumps out to Scott.
Yeah, that's what jumps out to me. But I get it. Right. So you're preaching to that audience. Yeah, that's interesting. I see where that would be a video that's circled around.
Yeah.
Because to say that Jesus didn't fulfill his potential,
right,
is a clickbaity
way
of saying, but he fulfilled his purpose.
Right.
So Okay, I get it.
Yeah, and when I wanted, that was a 1 minute clip of us. And to be just completely honest, I did not watch the full sermon, nor did any.
Oh, and I'm not going to judge it out of context.
Sure,
I'm sure there's a context there. I think what made it circulate was Jesus didn't fulfill his potential. Probably like a hot button.
Right. Which is fine. I mean, but I just at least wanted to bring it to the forefront because it was relevant for this.
From homiletics, semantics, I get it. I mean, probably it's pretty clever right there. I mean, well, we're watching the video.
Yeah, talking about it. Right.
And so people are talking about Jesus. Well, good for Mike Todd.
Yeah, right.
Because he's maybe put great. I mean, that's my reaction to this stuff is like, all right, I get it. From the communicator side of me, I totally get it. You kind of set up something that's the, it's like the what?
You're right.
And it's like the oh. So it's kind of the what?
Yeah.
The what is he didn't fulfill his potential?
Right. What?
That seems like it would diminish the fulfillment. Like he wasn't fully in what he was supposed to do, but he's basically making a good point that the purpose, he could have done anything.
Sure.
Yeah, of course. That's one way. If you talk what's someone's potential, you could. Yeah. That's the definition of the word. Potential, even like energy. You have all this potential energy stored up in a rubber band.
Yeah. The
kinetic energy is the transference of that into motion. And we judge it by the motion, not how much potential is there. So, all right, I get it.
Anyway, that was the reason we brought it up.
But it's a perfect setup. Like, are there things that Jesus could have done potentially?
Yes,
but didn't. That's the whole point of the episode.
Yes, and so that's why to frame this conversation topic, what I really want to do, we kind of have a list, and there were a lot of them, but 10 things. We had to pick the round number. 10 things
we had to narrow this down to a top 10 list. Right.
Could have done, but didn't. And really how I want to take this, we have a list of things. I'm going to present each one of them.
Okay.
And throw it to you because I want this to be more of, and this is the dynamic of, I'm kind of going to ask you a lot of whys of why we formulated this list, why we talked about it.
I like this. You get to pick my brain today. This is a little bit different than the other episodes.
Yeah.
So I like this.
Casual.
And I'm just sit back and let you ask questions.
Okay, good. Because you threw this out to me, and you really threw out the topic, and I was like, well, that's worth talking to. So, Mike Todd aside, let's jump right in.
Yeah, let's do it. Number one.
Topic, 10 things Jesus could have done but didn't. Number one. Number one, he could have revived or healed his earthly father Joseph if he died early. Interesting.
Yeah.
So there's some ifs in there. If Joseph died early, I want you to explain that. But explain that first, and then talk about the number one, which is Jesus could have revived him.
I'm glad we started here because this was actually like one of the first ones that we talked about, and we were kind of throwing this episode around like, hey, what could have Jesus done, but he didn't? Well, one is what happened to Joseph. Let's start there. Yeah. So his earthly father, Joseph, who was of Nazareth, lived there. What happened to him? Mm-hmm. Let's start with that. We do not know. There is any idea of what happened to Joseph as far as his death or disappearance from the gospel is nothing but conjecture. We just don't know. But we could ask the question, well, there's one theory is that he was much older and that he was a much older guy, Mary's much younger, and that Mary and the children just outlived him. Now, that was one thing. Let's say two things happen. Three would be a little bit more nefarious, and I don't buy the third one. The first one is he died of old age. Okay, that's part of a theory, like that he's the older man theory. The second one, he was a craftsman, a carpenter, which I want to get into that word in a second because that's a little misleading. Yeah. And actually, it's a very restrictive word that I think is the cultural side of it is a little bit more expansive. The third one is a little bit more nefarious, like he just disappeared, like he kind of just. He ghosted him. I don't buy that, and there's really nothing in Scripture that just supports that. Number one, he could have died of old age. The question is, why didn't Jesus prolong his life?
Yeah,
he could have, right? Let's say he could have, but then you could push against, well, what if he died before the first miracle?
Sure.
And then, so it's like, well, it's not my time, because when we get to Cana and he does his first miracle, that's the question, like, hey, it's not my time.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is he could have healed Joseph or prolonged his life if it's, well, he could have made his father just hang out perpetually if he wanted to.
This is a trickier one because of the idea. We don't know.
We don't
know what happened.
So I think there's that one. Or there's another theory. So his father was a craftsman. The word there, carpenter, every time you read the word carpenter, it's the word tectone in the Greek. And that word doesn't mean just woodworker. It means craftsman. A tectone is someone who actually could have worked with masonry as well. It is probably more, if you go to Israel and you visit locations, and on location, the buildings that were standing were not built of wood. It is more likely, because if you study the topography and geology, like just the ecology and geography of Israel, there's not a lot of trees. It is more likely that he was a stonemason. Or someone who worked with stone and wood. You got to work as a general contractor. You got to be able to handle all the material. So he is a carpenter, but that's an English translation of a word that should probably mean worksman's craftsman. Interestingly enough, there's a town right. It's north. It's a little due north, little northwest of Nazareth, and it was a city called Sepphoris or Sepphoris. It's Zaporri today. And at one point, when Jesus, when he was born, young boy, Sepphoris would have been the capital of the Galilee. Matter of fact, you can go to Sepphoris today, and one of the most beautiful mosaic tile floors is in Sepphoris. You can Google this. Google tile mosaic floor in Sepphoris, and it is this incredible tile mosaic floor. And it is believed that city was built during kind of Jesus's adolescence. It would be the right time.
Yeah.
It is probably the town that Jesus and his father Joseph worked in. Now, interestingly enough, in Scripture they call Jesus a carpenter, and so we know that Joseph lived long enough for Jesus to have picked up the trade.
Sure.
Because in two different accounts in Scripture, in one they says, "Isn't this the carpenter's boy?" Like that's one of the questions that's asked of him. Like, is it the carpenter's boy? And then another one is, "Isn't this the carpenter?"
Right.
So it is couched that. So he, and I bring all that up to say, what if Joseph died in a carpentry accident or a stone fell on him? Like he could, if that was the case, Jesus could have revived him, right? Or some tragic ending. This is just me going like, wow, what if? What could have?
Sure.
I think something a little bit more interesting is afoot here, though.
Okay.
I would encourage you to go back and read Simeon's words when Jesus is presented at the temple. In Luke chapter 2, Jesus's parents were amazed about everything that's being said about him, right? So they brought Jesus in for his dedication, 8 days he's brought in. So there was Simeon, and then there were two people there that saw Jesus, and they like freaked out in a really good way.
Yeah.
So in Luke chapter 2, verse 33 through 35, let me pull it up real quick. Jesus's parents were amazed at what was being said about him. Then Simeon blessed them, and he said to Mary, the baby's mother, "This child is destined to cause many in Israel to fall and many others to rise. He has been sent as a sign from God, but many will oppose him. As a result, the deepest thoughts of many hearts will be revealed." And this is what's interesting. "And a sword will pierce your very soul."
That last sentence there.
Now, I would encourage you to read with wonder why Simeon looked only at Mary and only directed those words to Mary if perhaps somehow he knew Joseph wouldn't be around for the crucifixion.
And that last sentence there, "a sword will pierce your very soul."
And he says it in the recipient of that line is Mary.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that maybe I was read that and be like, even Simeon's like, Joseph standing over to the side, and he doesn't seem to address Joseph as being going to be around in the end. Which is kind of prophetic. I don't know.
Yeah.
But Jesus could have revived his earthly father if he died early or died of age, accident, or whatever, but he didn't.
Interesting way to start.
But he didn't do that.
Right.
He didn't do it. He could have, but he didn't.
Awesome.
That was number one.
Number 1 of 10.
Of 10. Let's go. Number 2.
All right, so this one's interesting. He could have lingered in Capernaum healing people, but he didn't.
Right.
This is where we start to get into, right, Jesus performing miracles.
Yeah, miracles
Healing.
and mission. This is probably one more about mission. So a little bit of a context.
Yes.
I tossed this one out there. I was like, hey, Joe, let's talk about this. Because Jesus could have hung out in Capernaum or Capernaum, or how you want to pronounce it. That is Jesus' hometown. Not Nazareth is where he was born. But if you go, when I take people to Capernaum, there's a sign out that says Jesus' hometown.
It's an amazing. I was there last. Oh my goodness!
So there's a big sign out. I think it's brown and white. It's Jesus' hometown, and then so there's a lot going on. So you've been to Capernaum. I've been there a couple times. You remember what's there? The octagonal church. Yep. So Capernaum is the home of Simon, Peter, Andrew, some other people. And we see in Mark chapter 1 an interesting thing. So Jesus goes back towards there. He goes to the synagogue. You know, there's a synagogue right outside. And you roll from the synagogue right back towards the octagonal church.
It's kind of the center point, right?
Yeah, and it's right on the banks, right of the Sea of Galilee.
Those views, by the way, are
beautiful.
remarkable.
A bunch of millstones right there, too, which that millstone around the neck in the sea, that's another thing. So the octagonal church was built on top of Peter's house. And the octagonal church, obviously, so after Constantine made Christianity the first legal religion, then he sent his mother Helena to go visit. So these Byzantine churches are built on these specific sites. There's the octagonal church is built there at a place where in Mark chapter 1, Jesus goes, Sabbath is over, he starts healing all these people all night long, healing people, lining up in the streets, right? Come to Capernaum. Jesus is healing one night only.
Yeah.
Jesus doing the thing. And so he's healing people. And so it says early in the morning that Jesus goes out to pray. And the disciples run out there, bust up into his quiet time, screaming. It says they exclaim to him, like, come on out here. And so, Jesus is out there praying. And you'll see in Mark chapter 1 that Jesus, they were like, hey, let's go back.
Yeah.
We had a really good ministry, and Jesus goes, you'll see this in Mark chapter 1, 35 through 38. Nah, let's go. Let's go on. So I need to preach. And he says, we can't hang out here. Jesus could have hung out in Capernaum, healing people for as long as there were people to heal.
Sure.
But he didn't. And Jesus walked away from people who needed healing so that he could walk towards the cross. That's the why.
This is an interesting point, too, because we'll see this as a theme throughout. But Jesus, when you're reading Scripture, it is very clear that he has a firm understanding of what his mission on earth is.
High purpose.
And doing things at the time that probably seemed crazy, right? Like, why would you leave right now? Well, why? Look at what's going on. Look at who's here. Look at the potential. Why are we leaving?
I think this is where it's fair to say to Mike Todd type thing, like, did he fulfill his potential? Potentially, he could have stayed there and healed people, well, in perpetuity.
And many probably thought he should have.
But good is the enemy of great. That's a good ministry. The great ministry was the cross.
Right.
And so he could have stayed there. He could have healed people of their temporal sickness, never healed our eternal sickness by getting to the cross. And so that's the why. That's the answer to number 2. It's about the vision, the ministry of healing us eternally. Not because, face it, everybody at Capernaum died.
Right.
And then what? That's the why.
Sure. So number 2, could have lingered.
Could have lingered.
People, but didn't. Very interesting.
Yep.
Number 3 here. I'm going to jump to, we have on our list is number 4, but this is along the same lines of what we just talked about with number 2, because I think that there's a similarity to this one. However, it's a little bit different. So number 3, for the purposes of the episode, Jesus could have performed many miracles in Nazareth, but did not. First of all, can you explain, kind of, you're probably getting where I'm going, but what the difference is between the last one where we just talked about him in Capernaum versus Nazareth?
Right.
So it's a similar one. He could have performed miracles in Nazareth, but didn't. But there's an interesting, and it's actually somewhat explicitly said by Jesus, almost giving a context here. So explain that a little bit.
Yeah. So the Mark chapter 6 is where Jesus says a prophet's not wanted in his hometown. And I would say that if you're really familiar with the biblical narratives, when Jesus goes to Nazareth 2 times, Mark 6 is the reference you're speaking to. Luke 4 also. But they're different accounts, because in Luke 4, he reads the scripture in Isaiah in the synagogue. He says, today this scripture's been fulfilled in your hearing. So they walk him about 2 miles up to the precipice point. tries to throw him off the cliff, but he gives him the slip, ghosts him, somehow walks away. It seems to be Mark 6 is different because Jesus says, a prophet's not one in his hometown, and he doesn't do miracles in Nazareth. It actually says that in Mark chapter 6, the prophet is not without honor except in his hometown, among his relatives, and in his own home. And then it says, interestingly enough, he could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. So the ministry of Jesus was very subdued in Nazareth, and he was amazed at their lack of faith.
It's so interesting to talk about this because is it a familiar, like, can we dive into, I know we're supposed to keep this short, but like diving into the idea of like, why, what about it, about your hometown, and he talks about it is not without honor.
Well, go to your hometown, the people who know you and claim to be God.
Right.
It's because of the audacity of Jesus's. Let's say if he decided to like, oh, he's a good prophet, good teacher. All right, they're down with that.
Yeah.
But he claimed to be God. And that's, and people who know you are like, hey, I know this. Isn't this the carpenter's boy?
Right.
Like, isn't this the carpenter's son? Like we know him. Like, this is Joseph's boy, right? Like, and that's the thing. It's easy to do. It's easy to fool people who don't know you. And I'm not saying Jesus fooled them.
Sure.
But people who have a larger corpus of knowledge have to have a bigger suspension of disbelief. And if you have more familiarity, the deeper your sense of disbelief. And what I mean is like disbelief in the laws of physics and like how can you do this and how can you be God and all that.
It becomes more difficult.
It becomes more difficult. But also, I just think that we know this. Jesus is saying something that has been true before him. Jesus is not making that up. He's basically talking about every prophet that's come before him, going like, you try to tell people the truth, and they'll run out your own hometown.
Yep.
But Jesus doesn't do miracles in Nazareth. He could have.
Sure.
But he chose not to. And I think that has to do with his focus on the mission and keeping, like, this is what God told me to do. And for some reason, there's a lot of times Jesus doesn't do things he could have done, but for his own purposes and reasons chooses not to.
Sure.
And he didn't. So he did not do miracles much in Nazareth.
Yep.
And in Jerusalem too. He only does 2 miracles in Jerusalem as well.
So interesting, just that the kind of last two go together. Yeah. So again, number 3, could have performed many miracles in Nazareth, but he did not.
But he didn't. Well, I would say maybe why is because Jesus doesn't want those people to believe him just because he does miracles, but because they trust him.
Sure.
Which is kind of that thing like, hey, do a trick.
Right.
And I'll believe in you. And Jesus like, that's not the way you get to faith.
He's like, nah.
Yeah, and so this is maybe it's an issue of faith and not just like living by faith, not by what you see.
Right. Continued theme of Jesus understanding the long game, the
faith,
long approach.
Yeah, it's a long approach. Interesting question though.
So number 4 that we have now, that I like this one.
Yeah,
I like all of them, Scott, but this one speaks to me a little bit. Number 4, Jesus could have chosen the most capable to become his disciples. Instead, he chose unschooled fishermen. So an example here, probably something we're familiar with, we've all maybe talked about before, but Jesus calling the unlikely.
Yeah.
And the unlikely in terms of what culture's expectation of the likely is. Because we see that now, and I think that this, maybe above all of them, really can hit home to us to say, Jesus did not who we might have expected him to.
Yeah.
And that's deep.
Yeah, I'm thinking through that. And I've had some thoughts about this coming in a lot. I'm just kind of thinking on my feet here. But I want to start one with a little bit later and then come backwards a little bit. Okay. I want to go to Acts chapter 4, where Peter and John are there before the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin, so like in Acts 4:13, when they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men,
right?
They were astonished and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. So I want to start in Acts to say later on the ramifications, people are like, these aren't like the people that you normally would expect to have the audacity, the clarity, and the just intestinal fortitude.
Yeah.
These like these aren't trained men. Like I thought this is something like, how does that happen?
These guys.
Right. But they took note that they've been with Jesus. Well, that's Luke's trying to tell us in the Acts of the Apostle that being with Jesus creates this intestinal fortitude, and that's going to show. So that's the derivative of walking with Jesus. By the way, that's a good thing to write down. A derivative of walking with Jesus creates intestinal fortitude and just a propensity to stand and make proclamations that people would not expect you to be able to do. Going back to this idea also in rabbinical Judaism is kind of where you got to understand the backlens to this is that if these guys were called, like Matthew 4:19, Jesus says, "Come follow me, I'll make you fishers of men." So he's calling fishermen out of their boats, right? Peter, Andrew, these guys. He calls Matthew from the tax collector's booth. He's calling people that if they're doing a job, it's because they weren't chosen to continue into the rabbinical tradition. So typically a rabbi would come around, and around the age of around 13, when you can, like your early schooling, and now you can go to higher schooling, around the age 13, that kind of tops out for students or kids in Israel. And so if a rabbi came by and said, "Follow me," I mean, you were the best of the best. You were like the magna cum laude, summa cum laude of your class. Like these, I'm going to pick the valedictorians that high. If these guys they would have maybe have heard at some point, "Sorry, you're not cut out. Go home and do what your daddy does. Go fish." So that's why the sons of Zebedee are back with their dad. That's why these guys they're plying the trade of their father. And it's interesting, Jesus doesn't. So when Jesus walks by, you might ask the question, why would these guys drop their nets and follow Jesus?
Immediately. By the way.
It's because they got an invitation that had been passed on them. Like other rabbis looked at them and said, "You're not good enough."
Oh, that's interesting.
And when Jesus says to them, "Follow me because my yoke is easy," the yoke is the actual teaching of the rabbi. It's not. It's a metaphor. The yoke is what you would call. So what you yoked an animal with the beast of burden. The yoke, which we see this in clerical stoles now, is symbolic of the teaching. And so you're putting on the stole, that yoke. And so that you follow me, my yoke, and teach you. They were like, man, like we get a second chance at this, like the high calling. And so Jesus gives them this second chance. And so Jesus didn't pick the smartest of the bunch. He picked guys who had heard no, which is a credible thing, which for people who are like, man, can Jesus give me a higher purpose and calling when people have written me off? That's the whole thing. Yes.
I want to speak into that really quickly, the idea of how relevant that is. These are all relevant now, but how relevant that is for a culture now that is seeking. We've talked about seeking a lot, particularly a younger generation, but I think sometimes we're just seeking the idea of like, hey, you are worthy. Like you are chosen, you are called. And I think that speaks really well to that topic, because I think a lot of times there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of frustration and anger, sadness, whatever you want to call it, of, is this for me?
Am I good enough? Can I do this?
Right. And even like following Jesus, I think there are so many people who come into the church and say, okay, I see all of these people, you guys on Sunday, that's not me though. Yes, it is.
Yeah, I could never do that.
Right.
There's it's cliche, but cliches, well, they got some truth in them. That's why they hang around, that Jesus equips the called. He doesn't call the equipped. All right, I know that's cliche, and that's but it's this true though, right? It's your availability that Jesus can do more with, not your capability. Which I think is something that's great. That's a core tenet of Jesus in his missional mindedness about calling people to be the priesthood of all believers, and he's going to call people whom you least expect.
Absolutely. Number 4, that was. He could have chosen the most capable people to be his disciples.
But he did not.
Let's get in one more here before the break.
Number 5.
This one, I liked how you phrased this. I'm going to let you take it. But he could have fed the multitude without the help of the lunchbox. What are we talking about?
So he could have fed the multitude without the help of the lunchbox. This goes back to, I wrote not a book. I wrote a weekend curriculum one time called the Lunchbox Effect, and it's from John chapter 6, and it's basically the little boy, his fish and loaves, and so Jesus feeds the multitude in John chapter 6 using the fish and the loaves. So if you need some background, go to John 6, you'll see this. And Jesus used the fish and the loaves to feed the multitude, right? The thousands of people there. We can even extrapolate that it was more than 5,000. It was probably 10 to 20,000. Depends on how if men are counted and women and children aren't counted. A lot of questions around that. But what's interesting is Jesus didn't have to use the lunchbox to feed them, because Jesus doesn't have to have raw materials to do a miracle.
Which we've seen before.
Because think of it this way. The first miracle was the wedding at Cana, which Jesus created wine, good wine, and all he had was water. Jesus created wine without grapes. He didn't have the raw materials, and he didn't have all the things, so what you need for fermentation. So Jesus, in the first miracle, and perhaps why it is the first miracle, is because the wedding at Cana, the creating water turning water into wine, is harkens back to in the beginning God created, and he doesn't have raw materials. So at that point, he is a creator. Creators create out of nothing. Craftsmen use what's available.
Sure.
So Jesus didn't have to have the raw materials, because we see evidence looking in the prologue of both Genesis and John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He's in the beginning. He doesn't need raw materials.
Sure.
But he did it because he wanted to include people, and he wanted to include people to say, look, I can take a little and do a lot. Yeah. So the question is, he could have fed the multitudes without a lunchbox, but he chose, because he's always wanting to include people into the ministry.
I love that.
To tell you that I can take your little and do a lot. Like, just bring it to me, and you got to bring it to me. And I'm going to use the unlikely little boy's lunchbox to feed this multitude.
There's an intense, and again, it follows the theme of, there is an intense understanding of, and I don't want, but Jesus knew what he was doing.
Of course.
He understood, and it's the idea of why he spoke in parables so often. It's because he understood what would connect with, what I'll say, us.
Yeah, it's not lost. It's by design, by the purpose. He used a lunchbox to fulfill the higher mission. He didn't need it.
Right.
Like, he doesn't need me.
Right.
But it is so much better to be wanted than needed. In ministry.
Something we can relate to, all of us.
Yeah, I don't want someone to call me because they need me. Right. I want because they want to talk. Like, every time, people call you, like, hey, Joe, I need this. Like, why don't you ever just call me when you just want?
It's like, pick up the phone. Oh, I know he's calling.
I know he's calling. So Jesus, this is a perfect time that Jesus says, I don't need you. I want you to be a part of this. And a lunchbox is this metaphorical centerpiece to say, I don't need it, but I want it.
Love that.
Go find a boy, or go find something. And then it taps into the resourcefulness of the disciples, and it also shows their depravity, because they showed up empty-handed.
Love that. That's a good one. Number 5.
Yes.
Could have fed the multitude without the help of the lunchbox.
Yeah. Well, this is a good chance to take a break. We're halfway through.
Take a break. When we come back, we'll go, 6 through 10?
Yeah, let's do it.
Right here on Rugged Wisdom. Back in here, Rugged Wisdom, talking about the things that Jesus could have done but did not. We just rolled through 1 through 5, and let's jump right back in. Number 6.
I kind of like the top 10 list.
Yeah, this is an interesting way to.
This is fun, yeah.
It's a cool topic to jump into it.
Sure.
This might be we might have a bunch of top 10 lists here in the future.
I like it.
Number 6. Jesus could have arranged the Transfiguration as a public event.
Yes.
That's would have been cool.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So I remember thinking through this one and kind of tossed it out there. He could have arranged it as a public event, but he doesn't. So let's talk about that Transfiguration and where it occurred. The Transfiguration, if you don't know, Matthew 17 is a great place to read it. Matthew 17 is an account of Transfiguration. Let's talk about what it is and then what happened.
Sure.
Transfiguration is something that only 3 disciples got to see. That's why, it could have been a public event, but it was only 3.
Incredibly private.
Very private. Jesus had concentric circles of disciples. He had his closest 3, Peter, James, John, and then the 9 outside of that, and then that comprises the 12, and obviously Judas fell out of that, and it was refilled again in Acts chapter 2, kind of backtracks it. But then there was the 70, the 200, and the 1,000, so that Jesus had his concentric circles. The inner 3, Peter, James, and John, got to go with Jesus in 3 places that no one else did. The healing of Jairus' daughter, the Garden of Gethsemane, and also the Transfiguration Mountain. And that reversed the chronological order of Transfiguration. Transfiguration of Jesus, when he was glorified in his body, some heavenly, like he was transfigured into some his pre-earthly condition, whatever that is. And Peter gets really excited, like, this is awesome, because it wasn't just Jesus. He got to see Moses and Elijah there on the mountain. So this is a private event, 3 disciples and Jesus, and then three and two other cats, right? So there's there's six people. There are 6 people here. It's a private event. Where did it happen? It happened on a mount. It could have been Mount Hermon. It could be Mount Tabor. Mm-hmm. Mount Tabor is where it's historically celebrated. Mount Tabor is just south of Nazareth. There's actually the Church of Transfiguration is there. So the Catholic Church said this is where it happened, but that's where the church says it happened. Doesn't mean that's where it happened.
Right.
But you have Jesus there as a very private event. Now, here's an interesting factoid. Peter, James, and John were the only 3 Jewish people who saw Moses standing in the promised land. Because Moses, if you recall in Exodus, dies on the eastern banks of the Jordan. He didn't get to come in because that generation did not get to come in. So Joshua brought the Israelites in right across from Jericho. They come in, but Moses dies. So think of this, how incredible for the Jewish audience that those 3 unlikely fishermen, unschooled men, got to see Moses, the great leader who led them out of Egypt from Pharaoh, across the Red Sea, through the wilderness. They got to see him standing in the promised land. So this isn't small beans here. This is a big deal.
Yeah.
But Jesus kept it as a private event.
And my question would be why? Because you would think that something like this, again, we know we've talked about this is the big picture thought process, Jesus, and there's an understanding of what's going on.
Yeah.
But why? Why wouldn't this have been center stage? Why wouldn't this been the big deal?
I'll give you 2 whys.
Okay.
One simple, pragmatic. The other one is like, all right. The first one is very simple. This precedes the crucifixion. This precedes like, all right, we're going to Jerusalem. This is all these things that got to happen this way. The scope of that event would have drawn, it would have been it would have potentially would have kind of just derailed the whole missionary like track that Jesus was on, like how the things have to happen in the way.
Right.
And so he kept it for a small audience, those 3. So you got Peter, James, and John, Jesus, and then Moses and Elijah. Now, the other thing is they see Moses and Elijah, and it's a testimony to the Tanakh, which is because Moses is the one who's the Pentateuch in the first 5 books, and then you have Elijah, he's the prophet. And so when Jesus is asked later, what's the greatest commandment? And he says, love your neighbor like you love yourself. All the law and the prophets is summed up in this. So you have on the Transfiguration Mountain, you have the law, which is Moses, the prophetic part, which is Jesus, Elijah, and then Jesus is the culmination that ties everything up in Judaism into him, and the person is like just ties a bow around it.
Yeah.
And so pragmatically, that level of revelation would have just been like blowing it up.
The details of this narrative, and when you actually dive into it, it's you just look at it and you're like, wow, that's kind of
look
amazing.
at the privilege that those disciples. Also, what if this was those are the same 3 guys who couldn't stay awake in Gethsemane. And Jesus like, I need to give them like something that they can go like, dude, you remember that? We got it. Like, this is it. Kept them on task.
Yeah.
Or could this be, to harken back to one of the others in the list, in Acts 4, these are unschooled men. How in the world are they so adamantly informed? Because they saw that.
Yeah.
In that private event,
They're on the end.
now it's public later through the fortitude of the apostles. I said I'd give you 2 whys. That's the first. The second one is like, well, just sometimes just God in revelation means he's going to hold some cards close to his chest. Because if God exposes everything, it's not revelation.
Which is a hard one, by the way, for us. That causes some questioning, I would say. But there's a purpose behind it.
That's an interesting one. I like that one. I like that a lot.
Number 6, again, he could have arranged the Transfiguration as a public event, but he did not. Number 7, Jesus could have pleaded his case before Pilate. Interesting, when we talked about this one, it's, all these charges, of course, come up against Jesus, and this is when we talk about the story, we're getting to we're getting there.
You're right.
And but he doesn't make any claims against it. There's no words. There is no objection. It's just Jesus being charged.
I think there's at least 3 whys.
Yeah.
Here. One, and obviously, you can pull the God card and be like, well, it's because God doesn't want that to happen yet, right? And so Jesus is being obedient to the will of the Father, which is always That's always the why. He's being obedient to the will of the Father. He could have pleaded his case before Pilate.
Sure.
Because he knew there was a little bit of an ace in the hole. Pilate's wife was like, hey, you probably should let this one go. I got a dream about I got some bad juju going on here. Like, you need to let this one go. And Pilate's wife even tried to say, like, you probably I think this one probably should let this one go here. I think we're making a mistake. And Pilate, just because he fears his own job and the retribution of Rome, kind of carries through with it. But Jesus doesn't. And we see this in Matthew 27. Jesus is standing before Pilate. And to quote the scripture in verse 11, meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus replied, he was accused by the chief priests and elders, and he gave no answer. So Pilate asked him this question. So, don't you hear the testimony that they're bringing? So he's talking about the Sanhedrin, the governors, like all these people standing around. But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. So you have Jesus standing silent.
Sure.
So he's on the way to the cross, so no need to prevent that, to do the will of the Father. Secondly, this actually is a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy about the suffering servant, and that he's led as a sheep before the slaughter.
Yeah.
And the sheep are silent. And so the silence of the lamb, there's that movie quote, by the way, the silence of the lambs, the one who don't speak before judgment. But then there's that Jesus, like, I don't have to defend myself.
Yeah.
Because he also gets into a conversation about authority. And I got authority to release you. And Jesus is like, the only authority you have comes from my Father. So do with that what you will.
I'm going to stop you for a minute, because as we're talking about this, I think about just the natural human approach to having all of these is exact opposite of what Jesus did. Our human approach, and mine would have been like, hey, I'm going to fight this, especially if I do have the ace in the hole, especially if I do have a lot of things I could say, but Jesus doesn't do that.
You want to exonerate yourself.
Sure, that's the human.
But this is where Jesus is the perfect substitution for me in that scenario, and that's the whole thing. It's not that it's just that Jesus is the substitution for me on the cross. It's that he is the procession to the cross is the judgment of the law of the land, and in that he is also the perfect substitution. Because you put me there, I'm going to exonerate myself. I'm going to plead my case. I'm going to try to figure some way out, and Jesus just takes it. It's not that Jesus just takes the sin of the world. He takes the shame of the world. And he also takes on the desire to exonerate myself. And Jesus is like, I'll take it.
Yeah.
I'll take it. I could refute, but I'm going to take it.
But gosh, like that, just when you think about that from the human standpoint.
That's why I love this question.
Yeah.
Jesus takes the beating, he takes the accusations, and he takes the death that I deserve.
And I think one more thing on this is that in church, in our society, there's it's a big picture approach of Jesus paid it all. He did what he was supposed to do. He went to the cross. Yes, he did, and those are all true. But when you actually dive in let's take away the worship music and the surface level for just a minute. Yes, he did all these things. But when you take it to the human element and you actually think about what it took for Jesus because to get to the cross, Jesus had to do this first. He had to be obedient first. He had to sit there and say, I'm going to take it.
I love that Isaac Watts hymn, Jesus paid it all. The all, circle the all. Jesus paid it all. It's not just the cross.
Right.
It's this.
This is a part of that.
Part of everything that leads to it. He paid it all. He paid, like, they ripped out his beard, they punched him in the face, they beat him. And he also just took the accusations and just made no rebuttal because, sometimes Jesus is showing us how to be the bigger man. So why didn't Jesus refute? So that I could learn how to be the bigger man.
Sure.
Let God fight my battles for me. Trust his will, trust his purpose and his way. And God wins.
Yes. I love that you said that because paid it all. When I think about it, the natural idea is you just think of Jesus on the cross. But to think of all of the things and situations it took for Jesus to even get on the cross, unreal.
So he leaves a lot of things undone so that it leads to all of that.
Sure. Again, that was number 7. He could have pleaded his case before Pilate, but he did not.
Yep.
Number 8, we have circled here. And this one, I told you before the show that I wanted to talk about this one because it's similar, but we were just talking about leading up to this. Jesus could have escaped the grasp of the cross, but he stayed on it.
Yeah.
Jesus could have gotten off the cross. He was able to. He did not. Again, obedience. Again, this was part of the story. He could have escaped the grasp of the cross, but he stayed on it. And when I ask you why about this one, we all have a thought here probably of, well, we know why Jesus didn't get off the cross. Mm-hmm. But from a human standpoint, a practical standpoint, when I ask you, hey, why did Jesus not get off the cross? I mean, what comes to your mind there?
Practically, my mind, I'm just sometimes I get kind of wrapped up
it's
imagining the scene.
Sure. I encourage us to do that, though.
Practically, the nails didn't keep him on the cross. And I mean that in a practical way. Like it's think back when Luke chapter 3, Satan tempts Jesus in the wilderness. So he comes out of his baptism, and dove comes down, and God says from heaven, "That's my boy, whom I'm well pleased." Right. He goes into the 40 days in the desert of preparation, and he's there. And Satan tempts him in 3 different ways. He attempts him with appetite, make this bread out of the stones. Well, he could have done it because he didn't need raw materials. He could have done it.
Yep.
Then he's like, "Hey, I'll take you and show you all everything in the world. I give it to you. That's ambition." And he's like, "No, that's not mine. And that's not yours." And so then this thing, like, what if you threw yourself down? The angels will pick you up and rescue you. And Jesus goes, "Yeah. The angels can come down at any moment and rescue me." Yeah. So what kept him on the cross is the same rebuttal that he gave to Satan in Luke chapter 3, which was, well, the angels could come rescue me. I can do what I want, and the Father's going to protect me, but that's not the Father's will. So what kept him on the cross wasn't the nails, it was the Father's will, and it was his ability to see through and drink that cup and do the Father's will. He could have come off the cross. He could have done that, but he would have gotten to that point and not finished. Can you imagine the answer to the question? Get that close to the finish line,
run
the race towards the death, and there's also the resurrection that comes later. So it's like the first of the finish lines, right? Because the resurrection is the big thing. But get that close. What kept him there was obedience.
Yeah,
that's what kept him. Obedience. So that's a great thing for me. Like, what he could have come off the cross, but because of obedience to the Father's will, he didn't.
Well, and tell me if I'm offline here, but for me, it's this predetermined obedience.
Yeah,
I know I'm going to be obedient. I'm going to seek it through, and that's why when I think about bringing it back to, not that this isn't about us, but bringing it back to our day to day, we can look at this story and understand that idea of I am going to determine that I'm just going to do this. I'm going to be obedient, whether I want to be obedient or not, because the human element, we've talked about this, is I don't want to be obedient. Yeah. Sometimes that we think that I don't want to be obedient, but we see here the clearest and most vivid example of this predetermined obedience to God.
You remember in our conversation, we had Greg Sisson in here, and I said, one yes could be 1,000 no's. When Jesus said yes, this was just one of the no's.
Sure.
When he said yes to the will of the Father. So in the Garden of Gethsemane, preceding this, he's wrestling. All right, Lord, let this cup pass from me, but if not, I'll drink it. And when he walked out of that garden and he had said yes to drinking the cup, that was the no.
Yeah.
I know I will not come off the cross. So one yes to the will of the Father is 1 trillion no's. And I said that. Interestingly enough, on YouTube, that comment, it was a short that we put out, got more negative reactions than anything I've ever said on the internet.
That says it all, though.
I'm telling you, I was looking at some of the ratios of people who go thumbs up, thumbs down, or when they swipe away. When I said, when you say yes to Jesus, it's 1 trillion no's, that got a 60% disfavorable opinion from people hated it. And so,
but there you go.
That's it. But when you say yes to the will of the Father, it's 1 trillion no's. And so why didn't he come off the cross? Because he had already said yes. If he says no to the cross, then he's saying no to the will of the Father.
Sure.
So you predetermine your yes, and that's a great thing for us to live by. You predetermine, I will do this, and that embeds 1 trillion no's down the line.
I love it. So again, number 8, Jesus could have escaped the grasp of the cross. He did not.
Could have.
We're going to do 9, 10, and then we got a bonus as well.
Okay.
Number 9, Jesus could have evaded his captors in the Garden of Gethsemane, as he did in Luke 4, but he did not.
Yeah, he didn't.
So to talk a little bit about the situation and comparing it to what you're talking about in Luke 4.
This is similar to the idea of the cross, but Jesus could have evaded his captors in the Garden of Gethsemane. You might remember the scene. So they came to Jesus, and Judas kisses him. Interesting enough, there's a question: why does Judas kiss him on the cheek? Mm-hmm. The kiss of betrayal. That's where that terminology comes from, being betrayed by the kiss. Is because he's identifying him. Because the Roman guards like point him out, like, which one's Jesus? Mm-hmm. And the one I kiss on the cheek. Oh, okay, all right. Gotcha. We'll wait on the sign. You kiss him, we'll know who he is. That's a theory. That's a thought there. And so to identify him, because so if that's the case, well, there's some anonymity built into that. So there was no need for the kiss unless there's some anonymity there. So Jesus could have like just shifted into the shadows, like, which one was he? Which one do we arrest? I don't know. He's just this dude in the crowd. Yeah. So that's a little bit of a thing. He could have evaded his captors, and obviously, so Peter pulls out a sword, chops off the dude's ear, and then Jesus says, like, hold up, no. This is not what we're going to do. Now, we had talked about in Luke 4, when Jesus is taken to the precipice point back up in Nazareth in the north, he ghosts them, gives them the slip, and evades the people based upon timing, and that's not his death. Jesus is like, I've seen how I die, this ain't it. Yeah. So he gets to the garden, and he goes like, I've seen how I die, this is it. So put your sword away. And interestingly enough, so Jesus says in Matthew chapter 26, he tells Peter, put your sword back. Like, and he's put the sword back. And so Peter's like, all right, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. And Jesus saying like, I'm not going to die by the sword. I'm dying by the cross. That's a little baked in there. And this is what this is the crux. Do you think I cannot call on my Father and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? Mm. Like, I know how to get out of this. Yeah. If I say the word.
I have the answer.
But how then? This is the why. How then would these scriptures be fulfilled to say that it must happen this way? Now, that's a deeper why. It's one thing to say, I'm going to go to the cross. Jesus is connecting it not only to the will of the Father, but the inclusion that the Old Testament, the prophecy, is in itself the will of the Father and an extension of it. So he's not just saying, yeah, it's because my dad told me. He's saying, no. Everything in the scriptures, the prophetic word has to come, because this is how the prophetic word, this is the how, and the Old Testament is the how, and I'm going to do that too.
It's notable that Jesus does give a bit of a why here, because we see so many times in scripture where Jesus doesn't always give a why, and I would argue most of the time.
This is different because Jesus explicitly tells the why, and he hooks it not just to the will of the Father, but to the scriptures as well. Which is beautiful, because he's also saying that the scriptures, they are in accordance with the will of the Father. Yeah. So he's kind of giving, like, he's saying all this is coming into an alignment now. This is all coming, and it's got to go this way.
Right.
It's got to go this way.
This is the fulfillment.
So this is an easy answer because he gives us a very explicit why.
Right. So then again, we have number 9. Jesus could have evaded his captors in the Garden of Gethsemane. He did not. Which leads us to number 10. Okay. Which is one. And I know you made a note of this earlier, and it's an interesting one. Jesus could have verbally exposed the sins of the accusing mob, but he wrote something on the temple floor that made them drop their stones. Yeah. And that something is fascinating here.
Yeah, I like this because Jesus has an exchange in John 8. Mm-hmm. I believe. I think John 8. So John chapter 8, Jesus has an episode. So he is in Jerusalem, and somehow in the middle of the night, they meaning the religious elite, catch this woman in adultery. Mm-hmm. So she's sleeping with some other dude. Dude got away. Yeah. I think dude got away because they knew him. I think this is shady. I think it's shady from the jump. It is shady. So they bring this woman. Like, why? Where's the dude at? You know. Yeah. So they bring. It's like, and they want Jesus to either do two things. That if we're going to condemn her, like, you know what the law says, she's an adulterer, and so they're standing. They got stones. They're ready. They're cocked, locked, ready. Get her. They're cocked, rock, ready to rock, and just get her. And Jesus stoops down. I would encourage you to read this episode and pay attention to Jesus's body posture. He stoops multiple times, and his body posture, Jesus goes up and down, and follow his body posture. And he stoops down, leaves the woman face to face, and then he gets up eye to eye with her. And so they knew that if Jesus condones her, or if he condemns her, then they can blame her death on Jesus. Well, he killed her. Y'all see it. Yep. Jesus he kills, and Jesus murders someone. And Jesus is like, that's not going to happen right here. And so they want Jesus to condemn her. If he condones her, then they go, well, see, he's condoning. He's violating the law of Moses. But Jesus offers a third option, which is conversion. And so this is the only time that we see Jesus write anything. Because when I say see, because that's the thing, they see Jesus write. Yeah. The only time Jesus could have wrote something, but he didn't. The only time Jesus wrote anything was in the dust of the temple floor. Yeah. Well, what did he write? I believe that he wrote the sins of the men who had stones in their hand. Because whatever he wrote, they saw in each one, as he wrote in the floor of the temple, in the dirt, they dropped their stone, which is also prophetically beautiful, harkens back to Genesis chapter 2, when God creates man out of dirt. God put his hands in the dirt, stirs up dirt, makes man. When Jesus puts his finger in the dirt, he starts dwelling in their sin. Yeah. It's a beautiful... This is a beautiful touch back to Genesis chapter 2.
That's good.
And then perhaps they're watching him playing the dirt, and they're like, that's the God who created me. When God plays in the dirt, or when, someone who claims to be God plays in the dirt, that's a very creative thing. But I believe simply that he wrote their sins, and as they saw that,
stones are getting dropped.
Now, why didn't Jesus just verbally you call her an adulterer, like, you're a theft, you're this or that.
Yeah.
I think it's because the symbolic nature of the written word in a culture of Judaism is very powerful. It's also very subversive. It's very like, I'm not even going to say, like, it's the same reason Jesus is silent before Pilate. He's silent before these accusers. I don't have to say anything. I'm just going to I'm going to write a few words in the dirt here. And if you look over my shoulder and you go like, holy crap, that's me. Jesus like, I'm just going to write in the dirt. And he does.
Stones dropped.
He doesn't verbally have to say anything because the writing, the word alone, the written word alone is enough. Okay, let me say that again. The revelational word of God is enough to convict you of your sins.
That's big.
That's a big thing. So don't let that be lost.
Yeah.
He could have verbally said it. I think this is also, why doesn't God just come out of the heavens and say it? But he's writing it he's doing stuff all the time. And if you would look what he's doing, you'll see it.
I love that. I love this as an aside, but I always think of when I hear this about, you ever been playing backyard football and you like write the play in the sand, you're huddled around, you're like, all right, you're going. That's I kind of think of Jesus about.
I think it's the same thing. You're running the X route, you're running wide, you're on a fly, you're running the post. Everybody got it? Okay, let's go.
We'll drop our stones.
Yes.
Let's go. I don't know. He's like, Jesus is the ultimate quarterback.
Yes.
Well, I always think about that.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
We had a couple minutes left. I'm throwing in a bonus because we had this one that I love it. And so again, we'll go with the bonus. Jesus could have made a huge, this is how you phrase it, so I'm throwing it out there, a huge dramatic Easter morning return, but he showed up unrecognizable to Mary in the garden.
I love it.
Jesus could have made this a production. This could have been the event. It was the event, but this could have been the event of the century. Yeah. Jesus is back. He's back.
Yes.
But he just kind of shows up to Mary in John 20. And it's just, unrecognizable. And she doesn't recognize him at first. Jesus does it without fanfare. Gosh, if this were me, this is and it is, but I mean, he doesn't. How amazing is this?
I think this is, I was curious because I was just waiting to see which one you pulled. Because I know we hadn't made a list. I was like, I want to see which one you're going to pull. Because there are others that didn't make the list. This one's a bonus one. Why doesn't Jesus make a production on Easter morning? I think there's a lot of postulation to this. I think there's a lot of things he could have, but he didn't. I want to say that I feel like there's a rhyme and reason to how things begin in the garden silently. Think about how in the beginning, there's a garden situation, and that it takes you back to the garden so if you look at Mary, who, she doesn't even know who Jesus is because, her eyes are probably swollen from crying, and she mistakes him for the gardener and says, if you just show me where he's at, I'll go get him. And it's because of what happens in the garden. When Jesus reveals himself to Mary, she doesn't see. Faith comes by hearing. And he speaks her name, and he says, Mary. In that, she goes, and she recognizes.
Yeah.
It's that the revelation of God in that moment you get it will be when he calls your name. Don't look for some grandiosity.
Yeah.
When you hear God speak your name, you know
that's him.
That's up. This is new. He's back. Because that's the point. When God calls your name and you hear God, so listening, we're always looking for the big.
Yeah.
But God does his greatest thing in the stillness of saying your name. I think for me, that's just me. That's why I go with that one.
I think about this in conjunction with what we talked about earlier with he doesn't call the elite.
Yeah.
It's the whatever you want to call it. It's not what we would expect.
It's in the stillness.
It's in the stillness. And so he calls those we don't think he might call.
Yeah.
And he does things in ways that we don't think he might do it. Because I can tell you I would have been, this is it. But no, he does it in the stillness. He does it in the silence. And I think that's a hard thing to grasp, especially in our culture now.
I will end it by saying this. It's on brand.
Yeah.
It's on brand.
Isn't it though?
It's like classic Jesus.
Yeah.
It's like, if you know what to look for in the story of the Gospels, it's not surprising at all. This is completely on brand.
I just love it.
This is on brand.
Yeah, I love it. Those are 11 things.
Oh, that was a bonus.
We have a list,
and
we got more. But it just it shows the character. Yeah. It shows the love of Jesus, who he is. This was. And what a great way to kick off what might be a series for us in top 10.
Well, comment people if they like this format. Let's see what happens with it.
Yeah, I love it. There's a lot of rugged wisdom. That Jesus
and
could have done.
I like just being able to kind of respond. I had some thoughts about it, but I like being able to respond. So yeah, it's a great way to end.
Great way to end it. We appreciate it. We're having fun. We love it.
This is a lot of fun.
A lot of fun. It's a blast. We'll have our social media handles and all that. You can follow us. But again, just thank you for listening. This is a continuing journey that we're on.
Sure.
And we're enjoying it. So, Scott Johnson, I am Joe Wedra. Thank you so much for listening to this very unique and fun episode of Rugged Wisdom.